Hey guys, tonight we're settling in with one of those slightly absurd but very real corners of history. So get comfortable, let the day go, and let's drift back into a time when the most powerful people in the world didn't just surround themselves with jewels, silks, and golden goblets, but also with animals that really had no business being in a medieval bedchamber or a Renaissance garden. Yes, we're talking about royal pets. But not the fluffy little lapdogs or house cats you might be picturing. No, we're talking lions in moats, leopards on leashes, elephants paraded through cobbled streets, and monkeys that dined with kings. So, dim the lights and let's begin the strange and sleepy saga of kings, queens, and their very questionable choices in pets. Now, the idea of royals keeping exotic animals isn't new. If anything, it's one of the oldest royal traditions. Long before the medieval period, ancient rulers were already in the habit of using animals as a very flashy status symbol. And of course, if you're a king trying to convince your subjects that you're basically semi-divine, then why not have a leopard or a crocodile lounging around your palace to make the point? Because really, what screams "I am chosen by the gods" more than walking into your audience hall and finding a half-starved lion chained by the door? Let's float back all the way to ancient Egypt, where pharaohs were already indulging in animal collections thousands of years ago. Cats, of course, were sacred. They weren't just pets, they were practically holy roommates. But the more exotic animals, like baboons, cheetahs, and even giraffes, were imported as signs of power and reach. Imagine being some desert farmer invited to the palace and suddenly seeing a giraffe stroll by. That's not just a pet, that's propaganda on four very long legs. And while the Egyptians loved their cats, they were also known to keep lions. In fact, some pharaohs were depicted riding into battle with lions running alongside their chariots. That's one way to make an entrance. The Romans, not to be outdone in their constant competition with basically everyone, went even further. Roman emperors famously loved showing off their private menageries, filled with elephants, crocodiles, panthers, and pretty much anything that could be captured in a net and dragged back to Rome. While most of these animals were destined for the Colosseum, emperors also kept some as private pets, or at least as showpieces. Emperor Augustus was said to keep exotic birds, while others preferred monkeys or small lions. And naturally, because Rome was Rome, they didn't really care too much about animal welfare. For them, the rarer and more dangerous, the better. Because nothing says absolute authority like casually keeping a tiger in your courtyard. Now, sliding into the early medieval world, the tradition continued, but with its own unique twist. Kings in early Europe weren't exactly subtle. When they kept exotic animals, it wasn't really because they thought they were cute. It was because they wanted everyone to know that they had the wealth, connections, and sheer audacity to acquire creatures that nobody else in their realm had ever seen before. These animals were political tools, gifted from one ruler to another as a way of saying, "Here, take this leopard. Now don't invade my lands for at least 5 years." One of the earliest and most famous examples comes from Charlemagne, the king who basically rebranded himself as the new Roman emperor in the early 800s. Among his many gifts was an elephant named Abul-Abbas, sent to him by the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid. Yes, the very same caliph celebrated in the tales of the Arabian Nights. This wasn't just a random present. It was a massive diplomatic statement. Here, an animal that no one in Europe had really seen before, lumbering through Frankish forests like a misplaced boulder. Abul-Abbas became something of a celebrity in Charlemagne's court, paraded around as living proof of the king's international connections. Unfortunately, like many exotic pets in cold climates, the elephant didn't thrive for long. After a few years, poor Abul-Abbas died, apparently of pneumonia, because Northern Europe is not exactly the ideal spot for an elephant spa day. But even with their short lifespans, these exotic animals were valuable not only as gifts, but also as symbols of royal prestige. Owning a peacock wasn't just about having a colorful bird strutting around the garden. It was about saying, Look at me, I can afford something that eats expensive grain and contributes nothing. The irony, of course, is that while peasants were struggling to keep a few chickens alive through the winter, kings were busy feeding imported birds that screamed all night and occasionally attacked people. Let's drift further east for a moment. In Byzantium, the emperors of Constantinople were also well known for their love of exotic animals. They had menageries stocked with lions, leopards, bears, and even camels. And because Byzantines loved pageantry above almost all else, they made sure these animals were part of their endless parades and ceremonies. Lions were kept in gilded cages and wheeled out for state events, while peacocks strutted through palace gardens like feathered courtiers. It was less about companionship and more about intimidation wrapped in spectacle. Back in Western Europe, by the High Middle Ages, the trend of gifting animals had become an entire diplomatic art form. Imagine being the ambassador who had to carefully escort a pair of leopards across half of Europe just so they could be presented at a coronation banquet. These poor animals often spent weeks tied up on carts or marched along muddy roads, only to be dumped into a damp castle courtyard where they terrified the locals and slowly wasted away. But again, none of that mattered to the kings and queens who received them. For them, every leopard, every lion, every odd little monkey was another feather in their already overcrowded crowns. And this is really the main thing to keep in mind. Royal pets weren't pets the way we think of them today. They weren't cuddled on laps or pampered with treats. More often, they were chained, displayed, and treated like living trophies. They were props in the theater of monarchy. A king who could point to a lion in his courtyard was making a statement. I am just as dangerous, just as untamable, and just as foreign to you as this creature. And that's a fairly effective way to keep peasants in line, if a little hard on the lion. Of course, not every royal pet was exotic. Some kings and queens did keep more ordinary animals with genuine affection. Hunting dogs were beloved across Europe, bred with almost obsessive care. Greyhounds, mastiffs, and spaniels all had their place in royal kennels. Horses, too, were deeply valued, though again, often more for war and display than for companionship. Cats, on the other hand, had a more mixed reputation. Some queens adored them, while many clerics associated them with witchcraft. But even here, we see that animals in royal households always carried layers of meaning beyond just being pets. So in these early centuries, the stage was set. Animals weren't just companions. They were status symbols, diplomatic gifts, and occasionally walking metaphors for royal power. From Egyptian giraffes to Charlemagne's elephant, the message was clear. The stranger and rarer the pet, the more impressive the ruler. And as we drift forward into the later medieval and Renaissance worlds, this habit didn't just continue, it escalated. Castles became home to lions packing moats, bears chained in courtyards, and leopards lounging in royal gardens. But before we wander too far ahead, let's pause and let this image settle. A muddy Frankish castle in the 9th century, its thatched roof smoking in the cold air, and outside in the frosty courtyard, an elephant shivering under a woolen blanket while peasants whisper in awe and terror. That's the strange, sleepy world we're easing into tonight. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a medieval castle. You might see high towers, stone walls, a drawbridge, maybe a moat. But now add something strange. Inside those walls, chained in the courtyards or packing restlessly in wooden cages, are lions, leopards, even bears. Yes, real beasts. In the Middle Ages, kings and queens loved keeping exotic animals. They called them beasts of marvel because ordinary people had never seen such creatures. Most villagers in Europe had never traveled beyond their valley, let alone across continents, so the sight of a roaring lion felt like a miracle or a curse. When a noble wanted to impress guests, he would lead them not to the dining hall first but to the menagerie. Imagine stone pens in a shadowy corner of the castle, straw scattered on the ground, iron bars hammered by blacksmiths. Behind them, the golden eyes of a leopard or the shaggy bulk of a Syrian bear growling low. The animals were gifts, often sent by rulers of faraway lands. A lion might be shipped from North Africa, dragged across deserts, crammed onto a ship, then paraded through towns until it reached the royal court. To the king, it was more than a pet. It was a symbol of power. To own a lion meant you were as fierce as the lion itself. But keeping them alive was no easy task. Castles were not zoos. Meat was expensive, space was tight, and no one knew how to properly care for exotic creatures. Many animals starved, sickened, or went mad packing their tiny enclosures. Chroniclers write of bears chained so tightly they could only shuffle in circles, and leopards that lashed out at servants bringing scraps of food. And yet, fascination never faded. Picture a feast, banners fluttering, candles smoking, musicians playing. Then, at the height of the night, the king orders the cages brought forward. A bear is led on chains through the hall, its massive claws clicking on the stone floor, while nobles gasp and ladies clutch their veils. Sometimes these beasts were forced to fight chained dogs for entertainment. Blood spilled, roars echoed, and the crowd cheered. Not all encounters ended in spectacle. There are stories of tragedy, too. One English king kept a leopard that broke free and mauled a servant. In Germany, a noblewoman supposedly tried to feed her husband's lion by hand and was killed instantly. Still, the animals remained until death took them, or until they were gifted onward to another court. Perhaps the most famous collection of all was the Tower of London's menagerie. Starting in the 1200s, kings stored their lions and leopards inside the fortress itself. Londoners could sometimes peek at them, though at risk. Records tell of keepers losing arms and a polar bear that was tied to the Thames River so it could fish for itself. Imagine walking by the riverbank and seeing a white bear splashing after salmon. Why did these animals matter so much? Because in a world of constant war and fragile kingdoms, owning beasts no one else could tame sent a message: I am more powerful than nature itself. Lions stood for courage, leopards for cunning, bears for brute strength. A ruler who displayed them was displaying his own soul, or at least the image he wanted others to believe. And so castles were not just stone and steel. They were alive with growls and snarls, with strange scents of musk and blood, with the restless eyes of creatures far from home. The menagerie was theater. It was propaganda. It was the medieval way of saying, look upon my beasts and tremble. If lions and bears roared in the cold stone yards of castles, then monkeys and birds brought laughter and chaos inside the palace walls. Picture a royal hall, tapestries glowing with threads of gold, candles shimmering in tall iron holders. And there, perched on the back of a chair, is a bright parrot, feathers flashing emerald and crimson. It squawks a phrase it overheard from the queen's chambermaids, sending the court into fits of laughter. Medieval kings and queens adored exotic birds, parrots, peacocks, even ostriches. Their colors were unlike anything common folk had ever seen. A peasant might know only the dull brown of sparrows or crows, but here were creatures painted in living jewels. A parrot that could mimic human words seemed almost enchanted, proof that royalty lived closer to magic. But birds were only half the story. Monkeys, nimble and curious, were perhaps the most mischievous pets of all. Small macaques or Barbary apes were brought across the seas as gifts from merchants. In palaces, they became both beloved companions and constant troublemakers. Chroniclers write of monkeys stealing food right off noblemen's plates, tearing lace from gowns, and dashing up the rafters with stolen rings. Some were dressed in tiny tunics or collars, forced to perform tricks during feasts. Others simply roamed free, their sharp little eyes watching, waiting for a chance to cause mischief. Imagine a royal wedding. The tables groan with roasted meats, candied fruits, golden goblets. The air is heavy with perfume and the murmur of guests. Suddenly, a shout. A monkey has climbed onto the banquet table, dragging a roasted chicken in its tiny hands. It hisses at the servants who try to catch it, scattering platters to the floor. Nobles laugh, ladies squeal, and the king, though pretending to frown, cannot help but smile. Not all tales are light-hearted. One story tells of a monkey kept in a noble household that became jealous of a newborn baby. When left alone, it tried to carry the infant away, climbing to the rooftops before it was caught. The story spread as a warning. These creatures, while clever, carried a wildness that could never be tamed. Exotic birds too sometimes brought sorrow. Ostriches given as gifts, often starved because no one knew how to feed them properly. Some kings believed the myth that ostriches could eat iron, so blacksmiths fed them nails and chains, with tragic results. And yet the fascination never faded. In paintings of the time, you can often find monkeys hidden in the margins, painted alongside saints and scholars as little symbols of human folly, mocking our pride, our greed, our vanity. To medieval minds, monkeys were more than pets. They were mirrors, little beasts that reminded people of their own sins. Still, for the royals who owned them, they were status symbols. Birds that spoke like courtiers, monkeys that danced like jesters. Each one whispered the same truth: we are powerful enough to own the wonders of the world. So while lions and bears were chained as emblems of strength, monkeys and birds fluttered freely through gilded halls, stirring both laughter and unease. Their chatter, their cries, their bold antics made medieval palaces feel alive, unpredictable, touched by a strange sort of magic. Because in the end, what is power without a little spectacle? And what is a palace without its mischievous menagerie of feathered voices and grasping little hands? For all the laughter and spectacle pets brought to castles, the truth is not every royal creature lived a life of luxury. Behind the gilded walls and velvet curtains, there were darker stories, tales of cruelty, of blood sport, and of the tragedies that unfolded when wild beasts were bent into human games. Imagine a cold winter's night in a medieval town square. Torches flicker, the crowd presses close, their breath misting in the air. At the center, an iron cage. Inside, a bear paces restlessly, its heavy paws thudding against the frozen earth. With a roar, it is released, only to be set upon by dogs. The spectacle is not for survival, but for entertainment. Kings and queens themselves sometimes ordered such shows to amuse foreign ambassadors or thrill their court. This was bear baiting, a sport both brutal and beloved. To watch a mighty beast fall to smaller, snarling dogs gave nobles the feeling of triumph over nature. The bear, chained or wounded, had little chance. And it was not only bears. Lions, leopards, even tigers were sometimes forced to fight each other. Monkeys were pitted against dogs. Birds were tethered and used as live targets. To modern eyes, it seems unspeakable. But in those days, it was a mark of wealth to command life and death for the amusement of an audience. Some tales are almost too dark to tell. One chronicle whispers of a leopard brought to a European court, a gift from a distant sultan. When it proved too dangerous to keep, rather than release it, nobles staged a deadly fight. The creature, confused and hungry, was loosed into a pit where armored men with spears awaited. Its death was cheered, its pelt turned into a trophy. Cruelty also came in quieter forms. Exotic animals were often misunderstood. Ostriches fed nails, elephants starved because no one could provide the mountains of food they required, monkeys beaten when they acted wild. Many of these creatures, torn from distant lands, survived only weeks or months in the chill of Europe before perishing in silence. Even beloved pets sometimes ended in tragedy. A parrot that once delighted a queen was thrown into the fire during an argument between courtiers. A monkey who had been dressed in fine silks was punished with chains for biting a noble child. The darker truth is this: animals in palaces were not treated as family. They were playthings, symbols, entertainment, loved only as long as they amused. And sometimes they turned on their masters. One king, it is said, kept a lion too close to his chambers. One night the beast escaped its chain and prowled the hall. Servants fled, but the king himself, calm or foolish, faced it down with nothing but a candle in hand. The lion did not strike, but the court never slept easy again. Another tale tells of a monkey who, enraged at being beaten, attacked its owner in front of the royal household, leaving the noble scarred for life. In these stories, one sees the uneasy truth. No matter how much gold was spent, no matter how fine the collars or cages, wildness could never truly be caged. For every moment of laughter there was a shadow of fear. For every exotic gift there was the cost of suffering. Behind the sparkle of feathers and the roar of beasts there lingered a question: who was truly more savage? The animals forced to fight or the humans who cheered? And so the darker side of royal pets reminds us, history is not all wonder and charm. Sometimes the palace menagerie was not a symbol of majesty, but of cruelty dressed in silk. A spectacle built on suffering, gilded by torchlight, and remembered only in whispers that chill the soul. Not all royal menageries ended with cruelty in the ring. Sometimes, the animals themselves decided to rewrite the story. Picture a medieval town suddenly in panic because the king's leopard has slipped its chain, or the queen's monkey has dashed out a palace window. Escapes happened more often than the chronicles like to admit, and when they did, chaos followed like an eager court jester. There's one tale of a royal elephant in Paris. Gifted by a distant ruler, it was paraded through the streets to dazzle the people. But elephants are clever, and one evening it broke its enclosure. The city guards scrambled, peasants screamed, and bakers bolted from their ovens, thinking some mythical beast had come to punish them. Eventually, the poor creature was lured back with food, but not before it trampled a garden and terrified half the neighborhood. Then there were monkeys, always the mischief makers. A duke's pet monkey once escaped during a banquet, darted along the rafters and leapt onto the feast table, scattering roasted peacocks and pies. Guests shrieked, wine spilled, and the monkey reportedly crowned itself with a golden goblet before being dragged away. And birds. A falcon freed in the wrong moment could cause a royal hunt to collapse into chaos. Parrots learned to mimic servants and shouted insults at courtiers. One escaped parrot in Spain survived in a nearby orchard for months, living better than the peasants ever did. But not every escape ended in laughter. A panther in England once slipped loose and mauled livestock before being killed. A royal lion that broke its chain nearly took the life of a groom. For servants who tended these exotic creatures, danger was part of the daily wage, and the line between spectacle and disaster was a thin one indeed. Yet these disasters and escapes slowly taught Europe something. Wild animals didn't belong in cramped palace courtyards or private gardens. They needed more space, more care, more understanding. And so, the idea of the royal menagerie began to shift. From private playthings and prestige gifts, they slowly became collections to be studied, admired, and eventually opened to the public. The Tower of London, once echoing with roars and squawks, became a proto-zoo. By the 18th century, anyone could buy a ticket to see the king's lions, leopards, and monkeys. It was a strange mix of education and entertainment, half curiosity, half carnival. Other courts followed. Paris, Vienna, Madrid, royal menageries transformed into the early blueprints of modern zoos. Still imperfect, but a step away from cages of cruelty and toward institutions that at least attempted understanding. Of course, accidents never truly stopped. Animals continued to escape, continued to remind their human keepers that nature was not so easily tamed. But the escapes became part of the folklore. Stories of lions at the tower, parrots in orchards, elephants on the loose. They became legends whispered to wide-eyed children, a mix of fear and wonder. And as the royal pet collections evolved, so too did the public's view of animals. No longer just symbols of power, they became sources of curiosity, study, and even sympathy. By the 19th century, the menagerie had transformed into the modern zoological garden, still flawed, but carrying the seed of something better. So the story of strange escapes and royal accidents is also the story of change. From chaos at banquets to lions packing behind iron bars, It was all part of the slow, awkward journey from medieval menageries to the zoos we know today. A tale of folly, mischief, and the occasional monkey in a crown. So here we are, at the end of our long twilight wander through royal menageries. We've seen monkeys in velvet jackets, lions roaring in castle halls, parrots heckling courtiers, and even elephants on midnight strolls. But what does it all mean? Why did kings and queens, with all their gold, armies, and crowns, feel the need to surround themselves with animals? At the simplest level, pets were power. To keep a lion in your courtyard or a leopard on a chain was to show that you could command nature itself. Every exotic gift was a living trophy, a reminder that even faraway lands bent to your will. If peasants owned chickens, kings owned panthers. If the villagers kept cats for mice, queens kept monkeys for mischief. But beyond the politics of it, there's something more human here. In the quiet hours of the court, when banquets ended and the torches burned low, a queen might stroke the feathers of her parrot or a king might scratch behind his hound's ears. Amid the cold walls of stone palaces, animals offered warmth. In lives surrounded by ceremony, they brought something resembling joy. And of course, pets were also mirrors. A cruel ruler treated them as disposable toys, subject to fights and neglect. A gentler monarch showed kindness, sometimes more to their beasts than to their own subjects. The way royals kept animals tells us not only about their wealth, but about their character. Take the king who laughed as his monkey stole goblets from the table. His court remembered his humor. Take the queen who wept when her parrot died. Her tears told of tenderness beneath the crown. Take the dukes who staged bloody bear-baiting matches. Their cruelty echoed far beyond the ring. As centuries passed, the royal pet evolved. From chained spectacle to pampered companion, from power symbol to beloved friend. By the time menageries became public zoos, the animals had shifted from being mere possessions of monarchs to curiosities for all. And eventually, in modern times, they became subjects of study, conservation, and yes, even sympathy. So what do these strange pets of kings and queens tell us? That power is never satisfied with gold alone. It seeks the roar of a lion and the chatter of a monkey. That even in the coldest castles, humans longed for companionship, however odd the form. And that history is always a blend of wonder and shadow, of parrots in crowns and lions in chains, of laughter at banquets and tragedies in cages. Tonight, as we let these tales settle into the hush of the dark, maybe the thought lingers. Humans and animals have always shared stories. Sometimes joyful, sometimes cruel, sometimes simply absurd. And perhaps, in the end, the strangest thing is not that kings kept leopards or queens kept elephants. The strangest thing is how familiar it feels. Because whether in a medieval castle or a modern home, the bond between people and their animals is one of the oldest stories we tell. And so we close the book on this particular tale. The torches burn low, the lions have gone quiet, the monkeys are asleep, and the parrots have finally stopped shouting at courtiers. History, as always, is a little ridiculous,